Hello and welcome to Newswire. I'm Jawad Tehami. The US President Donald Trump has said the tensions between India and Pakistan have reduced, but the situation in Indian-occupied Kashmir has not improved. The curfew and the communication blackout in the valley has now entered its 44th day. More than 4,000 Kashmiris, including Hurriyat leaders and activists, remain under detention. The country's Supreme Court ordered the government to make every endeavor to bring normalcy there. Jammu and Kashmir's former Chief Minister Farooq Abdullah was arrested under the Public Safety Act. The UN has previously condemned the Indian Public Safety Act as well. Kashmiris, on the other hand, term it as a draconian law. To talk more about the situation in Indian-occupied Kashmir and the latest statement by the US President Donald Trump, we are joined by Ms. Nayeema Mahjoor, journalist from London, and Mr. Mahmood Faiz, human rights activist, also joining us from London, and Mr. Asif Durrani, former ambassador from Islamabad. Thank you all very much for being part of the show. I will start the discussion from Mr. Asif Durrani. Sir, how do you see President Trump's statement when he says the tensions between Pakistan and India have been reduced? On the other side, Indian unprovoked fighting at the line of control continues, resulting in loss of civilian lives. Do you see the statement by President Trump realistic?
I wish President Trump had also given any example that how these tensions have been reduced between Pakistan and India, because one fails to understand what symptoms President Trump saw, which made him to make this conclusion that tensions have been reduced between the two countries. And as you said, there's a continuous persistent firing along the line of control. Indians have been killing innocent civilians on our side of the Kashmir, in Azad Kashmir. And for Pakistan, it is a very big challenge, because if Pakistan has to retaliate in the Indian-occupied Kashmir, then the Kashmiris are there on other side, on the Indian-occupied side.
Ms. Mahjoor, how do you think that President Trump is when he is taking interest in Kashmir issue? Don't you think he needs to do more to ease the situation in the occupied valley?
Well, Jawad, I think Kashmiris particularly have a very little faith in Trump's these statements, because we have seen recently when there was a G7 summit and how he was conversing with Mr. Modi at that time, because, in Kashmir, the situation is very grim, and every day the people don't know where they are going to do from this here after this abrogation of Article 370 and the clampdown and the communication blackout and everything. This time when Trump is saying that he has seen some progress between India and Pakistan, what type of progress he is speaking when 8 million people are locked down, when there is no communication, when the hospitals have a very little staff to look after the ailing persons. People don't go out. Children are inside homes. What type of progress? Is this the progress only on the LOC, where the firing has stopped, but it's still going on there? I'm not sure what type of progress he is speaking, and I think the Kashmiris have no faith in such statements unless something very serious, very solid, very concrete steps are being taken by both the governments, including Mr. Trump.
Okay, Mahmood, Mr. Mahmood, do you think the Indian Supreme Court had yesterday ordered for the government to bring back the normalcy in Indian-occupied Kashmir? And in response to that, the center said that more than 88% of the police stations in the Kashmir division, the restrictions have been reduced over there. Is that the situation? Do you think that's the true statement given by the center in response to the Supreme Court's order?
First of all, namaste to all the viewers of your TV channel. First, you said normalcy. Well, how do you define normalcy? if having 820,000 armed soldiers on your doorstep is normalcy, then no, it's not. It's absurd. The only way you will get normalcy is by the Indian army to come out of Kashmir and to have some sort of all the political prisoners to be released, and then to have a plebiscite. So that's normal. Having a occupying force in your country on your doorstep, armed soldiers at every corner, having the ability to torture, arson, extortion, have all these things and not be held accountable. How can that possibly normalcy? No, the only normalcy there can be is when the army is out of Kashmir and the people are left to live their lives in peace.
Mr. Faiz, yesterday, former Chief Minister of Jammu and Kashmir, Mr. Farooq Abdullah, has also been arrested under Public Safety Act. And this Public Safety Act has been termed as a draconian law and has also been condemned by the international community, particularly when we talk about the United Nations. Could you please shed some light on this Public Safety Act? Why is it termed as draconian law by the Kashmiris?
Well, first was this Public Safety Act. I want to ask them, what danger was Farooq Abdullah, who is actually a pro-Indian politician, an issue of public safety? There isn't any. This is statutory carried out by a fascist regime in India. It has no respect for democracy, it has no respect for normalcy, and it has demonstrated by arresting all political activists in the region.
How do you think can a government legislate and enforce a law which is against human rights conventions, particularly when we talk about the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights?
Well, as for the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, I think it's every article in the Universal Declaration the Modi government has broken. It has, as I said before, it has no respect for international law or for law. It only wants to propagate, appeal to its very minute 3% of the population of India on the extreme right of politics. As for how to bring them, I think the international world needs to work together to bear pressure. I was with Chukka Muna yesterday, who's the Foreign Secretary of the Liberal Democrats, Shadow Foreign Secretary for the Liberal Democrats, and he's shown great concern about the issue of Kashmir. And the Liberal Democrats are, which is third biggest party or even the second biggest party, are taking the Kashmir issue very seriously and are looking at sort of asking the UK government to work multilaterally, not unilaterally, multilaterally with the EEC and the world community to try and bring India accountable under international law and try and get human rights organizations into Kashmir and try and find the truth of what's going on. I mean, how Donald Trump can say that, things are improved. No, they haven't. The only time that they'll improve is if there isn't a military force, human rights organizations are allowed to enter, monitor, and report on what the situation is. And then we can see that we're taking a step forward and not back to the dark ages with the extreme right-wing government.
Okay, Mr. Mahmood, I'd like to point to Ms. Mahjoor. Do you think there is ample mechanism at the hands of the international community and particularly the United Nations if India is enforcing or implementing the laws against the spirit of international conventions and Universal Declaration of Human Rights? There is ample mechanism at the hands of international community to make India stop its transgressions.
If you remember the UNHCR report last year and in the last few months, at that time it was also, demanded that some human rights fact-finding mission should go to Kashmir and the Indian government should allow, and including Pakistani government. And at that time you have seen the belligerence of the Indian government which didn't allow any human rights fact-finding mission to go to Kashmir. And at this time, so much is happening in Kashmir. There's a force of silence this time. Anger is rising out. And there is a mechanism. Why would you say there is not an ample mechanism? There is. But it's a determination and it's a will and it's a political, stand which these international communities have to take, and they have to force it upon Indian government that they should allow these fact-finding missions to go to Kashmir and see what's happening there. And maybe they will find the situation is better. as Indian government is saying, and sometimes it says it's a normal. Maybe these fact-finding missions will find the situation is more normal, what we say on the channels or what we write about it. But
okay, Ms. Mahjoor, you've just mentioned that there are certain mechanisms at the hands of the United Nations that it can send in the fact-finding missions in order to investigate the human rights abuses which are taking place at the hands of Indian paramilitary forces there. So a couple of days before, the European MPs have also called for the trade and travel sanctions. How do you see the international community can enforce these trade and travel sanctions on India?
I mean, at least there is a ray of hope at this time that after so many decades, the international community is coming to the expectations of the Kashmiri people that they are raising voice in favor of Kashmiris and these travel and trade restrictions. And do you think, if Kashmir is not safe for Kashmiris, how can it be safe for the foreigners, for Europeans to go there? So the international community need to see that. Why it is not safe, why it has been made unsafe. So the truth will come out and they will find out. And they should, ask Indian government to allow them to go there and see for themselves why these hotels, so many hotels, 5-star hotels, are vacant at this time, are empty at this time.
Okay, Ms. Mahjoor, I'll come back to you and we'll this point further from here on. I'll go to Mr. Durrani. Don't you think when there is a threat of a conflict between the two nuclear-armed nations like India and Pakistan, the United Nations' role increases manifold rather than mere statements? What do you have to say about that?
I think situation is very serious between Pakistan and India. And naturally, this Kashmir situation has further aggravated everything. And when you talk about the international community, especially the United Nations, it's normally when the situation on the ground gets worsened, so the UN comes into play. But I'm slightly disappointed with the performance of the UN, because here the Indian size, its economy, that is dictating the terms in the international politics, and whether it is Europe or whether it's United States, since they are the champions of human rights. So it is.
So do you think that when it comes to economy, it is more important than that of upholding the human dignity and human rights?
I'm coming to that. So that's why when the human rights have become a casualty because of their trade benefits, and it is only the international media for the time being which is raising human rights violations in the occupied Kashmir. But it is also a big, you can say, change if you look at it from the Kashmir's perspective. During the past 7 decades, especially for the past 3 decades, media had a particular angle and version about the struggle in Kashmir. And then they would also, after the 9/11, they would drag terrorism element. But now everyone is awakening to the fact, especially the media, that it is not terrorism. Actually, it was a pretext of terrorism which India used and tried to suppress the voices of the Kashmiris. And its culmination came when India abrogated Article 370. And even that Article 370 is a sham. Reason being that when Article 370 was annexed in the Indian Constitution, Kashmiris were not asked.
Mr. Durrani, you have raised a very pertinent point over here regarding the role of media. When it comes to the role of Indian media, it had been building a certain narrative against Pakistan. I like to take this point. On the contrary, when we take a look at the pattern of the media reporting, that is international media, it has been reporting the atrocities, and particularly after the revocation of Article 370 you just mentioned. Mr. Faiz Mahmood, do you think that there is a contradiction between understanding of this Kashmir issue as far as when it comes to the reporting of international media and the understanding of this issue by the international community when it comes to the policymakers?
I think there is a bit of a misunderstanding. It's always been looked at either as Pakistan versus India or Muslim versus Hindus, when it's not. It's a question of national sovereignty and human rights. Going back to what we talked about, the European Parliament taking a step, the Liberal group has worked very, very hard, especially Mohammed Shafaq and Phil Banyan, who sort of got the Liberal group together in European Parliament and sort of raised this issue. And then, of course, there's us, the individuals. My colleagues earlier were talking about the economical. Well, what you have in Indian occupied Kashmir is state terrorism. And if you're buying goods that are made in India, you are contributing towards economically to that state terrorism. So we as individuals can do something by simply boycotting goods made in India and write you to the firm and letting them know, look, I'm not going to buy your goods because they're made in India and you're not going to contribute to state terrorism.
Okay, Mr. Mahmood, I'll Ms. Nayeema Mahjoor. Do you think that Indian Supreme Court's decision that it passed yesterday to bring normalcy back to Indian-occupied Kashmir, do you think the Indian government will actually abide by this in letter and spirit?
I think, Jawad, this is the only institution now left where people have little faith, and we have hope that the Supreme Court will come to the rescue of the Kashmiris, particularly regarding these draconian laws, under which former Chief Minister has also been put under house arrest and jail. I think we have to wait because there are so many petitions in Supreme Court regarding these curbing of the human rights and violations of these rights. So we have to wait because, the Supreme Court, I have heard that Supreme Court Chief Justice is going to retire very soon. And we don't know what will happen to this institution when the new Chief Justice takes over and what will happen to these petitions. So we have hope, but I'm not sure that the restrictions and the curbs are going to be soon lifted until government of India is quite sure that there will be no protests in Kashmir and there will be no
I got
anger.
your point. Mr. Durrani, do you think there is an element of malintention on the part of the Indian Supreme Court itself when it has ordered to bring back the normalcy, conditionalizing that one to the national security?
That's correct. You have said it. Because the Indian Supreme Court's caveat that it has to bring normalcy, but at the same time they have to keep in mind the national security. What does it mean? It means that the government of India would be at liberty telling the Supreme Court that situation is not normal. They can use the pretext of so-called terrorists who can disrupt the peace in the occupied state. So there could be many, many excuses they can do because it's just not when the citizens, they cannot approach the occupied Jammu and Kashmir High Court. So what are we talking about the Supreme Court? And Supreme Court would be in fact basing its judgment on the basis of evidences given by the High Court or the government officials. There is no version of the common man. There's no version of even the pro-India politicians like Farooq Abdullah, who has been detained under PSA, which means he can be detained for 2 years without being referred to the courts. So it's a sham.
So, Mr. Durrani, the point you just mentioned now, where there is no rule of law and the government of a certain country is going against its own constitution, against the decisions of its high courts, the Supreme Court, against the wishes of its people. And on the other hand, it calls itself the world's largest democracy. What kind of a nation that would be? How would you term that nation?
First of all, I would say that it's not a rule of law. It's a fascist law. And this fascism is, they have made Indian occupied Kashmir as an example. And through Kashmir, they want to propagate their agenda in India, especially against the minority. And in that, also, Muslims would be at the receiving end. So it is a very dangerous game, Indian ruling party, BJP, and its subsidiary flanks, RSS, BHP, and Bajrang Dal are playing.
Mr. Mahmood, what do you think after Mr. Imran Khan gave a couple of interviews to the international media in which he said that any sort of conventional war between Pakistan and India might turn into a nuclear conflict. After this statement, and before we saw that President Trump had offered for mediation in order to resolve the Kashmir crisis. And today he said that there is reduction of tensions between both of these countries. Do you think it's owing to that particular warning or the fear that has been shown by Prime Minister Imran Khan?
Well, I think, yes, the Indian Secretary does need to react to that. These are two countries with great nuclear power, and Pakistan is a much smaller country. And if, for example, it came to the conflict where we thought it was going to be overtaken, literally, by the amount of, the force that India has, and it would possibly look at nuclear power, but having a nuclear war between Pakistan and India does not benefit anyone. It's not a benefit of the people of Pakistan and India. What benefits the people of Pakistan is a peaceful Pakistan and India living side by side, spending money on their infrastructure and not spending money on arms buying it from the West. That makes Pakistan a better country, and it makes India a better country, and it makes Kashmir a better country, above all for its citizens living there.
Okay, Mr. Faiz, thank you much for being on the show today. I'll go to Ms. Nayeema Mahjoor. What do you think what we can expect as President Trump has also said additionally that he is expected to meet the premiers of both the countries, most probably at the sidelines of the United Nations General Assembly this month?
Let's hope the best, and let's hope that he is using his office to bring both countries on the table and talk Kashmir, resolve Kashmir, and give people of Kashmir a chance of peace, because for the last 45 days, they haven't been allowed to breathe properly. So let's hope for the best, and let us wait what's going to come out of this summit.
Okay, thank you very much, Ms. Nayeema, for being on the show as well. The author joining us from London. Mr. Durrani, what do you think, what we can expect out of these meetings President Trump has hinted about, which might probably be taking place at the sidelines of the United Nations General Assembly?
I think good sense should prevail, because by ratcheting up tensions, it's only going to harm the people on both sides. In India and Pakistan, both are nuclear powers, and if the situation gets out of control, then we can expect or we can draw very devastating scenarios, which one should avoid. If a meeting takes place on the sidelines of the UNGA, and if President Trump can play the role of a facilitator or a mediator, so I think we should keep our fingers crossed. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Asif Durrani, Ambassador, joining us from Islamabad. Here we take a short break, and after we return, we'll discuss rising tensions between the US and Iran. We'll be back in a bit. Stay with us. Welcome back to Newswire. US-Iran tensions between the US have reached new heights. US President Donald Trump has said that we are locked and ready after the attack on two Saudi oil facilities. Trump said Iran was likely to blame and the US was ready to help a key ally. Today, he said that I don't want war with anybody. The attacks on oil facilities shut 5% of the global crude output and triggered the biggest surge in oil prices since 1991. Yemen's Houthi rebels have claimed the responsibility. However, Saudi officials said that the weapons used were Iranian. On the other hand, Iranian President Hassan Rouhani said the attacks were an act of self-defense by the Houthis against the Saudi-led forces conducting an air campaign against them since 2015. Russia and China have called for a de-escalation of the tensions. To talk more about the developing situation in the Persian Gulf, we are joined by Mr. Demiradas, a foreign policy analyst from Charleston, South Carolina in the US, and Mr. Ahmed Rushdi, senior foreign policy advisor to the Speaker of Iraqi Parliament from Baghdad, and Mr. Mostafa Khoshcheshm, an analyst from Tehran. All of you, thank you very much for taking time out and being part of the show. Mr. Demiradas, today President Trump has said, I don't want war with anybody. But before that, right after the attacks, he had said that we are locked and loaded. How do you see both of these statements?
Yeah, Mr. Trump has stated before that the United States was actually ready and locked and ready to hit when the $220 million drone was hit and struck by Iran. He reiterated that the U.S. was ready to attack Iran after that, but nothing happened. So there are a couple of reasons why we should expect that there is not going to be a military confrontation between Iran and the United States. First of all, a military strike against Iran by the United States will start a war that the repercussions of which will be heard across the Middle East. And most importantly, there is the 2020 presidential elections in the United States, and Mr. Trump would not really want to be embroiled in a military conflict that most Americans believe that it is not America's business. Another important aspect of it is...
Beg your pardon to interrupt. You have just already mentioned that in June, the US president also had given the statement to launch an attack on Iran. And then what were those reasons that prompted him to take back his decision then?
An attack against Iran will start a war in the Middle East. Therefore, the United States is avoiding attacking Iran in the Middle East.
Okay, I'd like to take this point to Mr. Mostafa. Do you think what are the reasons why such a contradiction in the statements? One day, the US president gives a statement that they are locked and loaded, and on the other day, he said that he is not ready to go into war with anybody.
Hello, and thanks for having me. Well, true, I share the views expressed by my colleague, Dr. Demiradas, that the United States knows pretty well the dangers of any kind of war with Iran. As a matter of fact, both the United States and Saudi Arabia are shy of acknowledging that this has been done by the Yemenis, because that would be a humiliation of the so-called state-of-the-art technology that has been sold to the Saudis by the United States. The Patriot missiles have failed to intercept these drones. So they are avoiding any kind of acknowledgement in that respect. But at the same time, the U.S. incentive is linking the story to Iran, because they intend to keep the pressure on Iran and bring the NATO allies and other European allies of the United States into company in order to pressure Tehran to eventually push Tehran to the talks, especially in the next week visit by President Rouhani to New York, that Iran has rejected any kind of meeting with Donald Trump outright. And even today, the Iranian leader reiterated that there won't be any kind of talk, including any meeting with Donald Trump next week during President Rouhani's visit. But Donald Trump knows that if he intends to keep the pressure through sanctions as well as military threat on Tehran to push Tehran to the talks, but at the same time, he knows that war is no option. A year before a new election, any kind of war would be devastating to his re-election. Also, a war in the region would set fire to the entire region. The Saudis know that half production with no casualties is way better than no production with hundreds of thousands of dead bodies lying across the country. So they are wise enough to avoid any kind of war. That's why the Saudis were complaining, actually, somehow today, that they have not been presented with any kind of evidence or proof by the United States to prove that Iran is linked to this attack. So the U.S. Is trying to push the situation to the borders of tension, the highest borders of tension possible, but avoid any kind of war, because they are empty-handed as regards any proof or evidence to link Iran to these attacks. And also, they are escaping the dire repercussions of any such war for them, their allies in the region, including the Israelis, as well as the dire repercussions of any kind of conflict with Iran for global energy production and export and prices.
Mr. Mustafa, you have just mentioned a strong reaction by the Iranian Supreme Leader Ayatollah Ali Khamenei. Also, we'll come back to that particular reaction. I'll move to Mr. Ahmed Rushdi. So, sir, how do you think when the president has called also for the full investigation before any military action, do you think it's the shifting of the responsibility for dealing with the entire situation on Saudi Arabia's own shoulders?
Well, I think, first of all, Donald Trump is actually working according to his Donald Trump agenda. And we all know that Donald Trump is a businessman. So he's looking in all his actions in a way that he will make a deal. So either he thinks his statement, his last statement, either he wants more money from the Saudis or he will not bother to attack any kind of target, and he will make his own ally, which is the Israelis, doing his job. So while America go to war with Iran now, and he has about 1 year for the next election, for 2020 election. So that's why I think Trump first said, okay, we are ready, and we're ready. Then he becomes more Donald Trump, the businessman, that he thinks that, okay, Israelis will say, we're going to do it, especially the Israelis now have elections, and Netanyahu wants to make his own job as a Zionist man, as the one who is protecting Israel from Iran. So he will do the job instead of Trump.
Mr. Rushdi, please stay with us. Mr. Demiradas, what does Trump's posturing back and forth between aggression and conciliation with Iran tell us about the U.S. foreign policy that is in play at this very point in time?
Yes, this basically tells us that the U.S. Under the current administration has inconsistent foreign policy, and this back and forth movement in foreign policy with regards to the recent attack on Saudi Arabia is because the United States wants to cater to Saudi Arabia and appease the Saudi warriors about the future attacks coming from Iran. Therefore, there is this back and forth movement. The U.S. is unwilling to start a war against Iran because of the Saudi oil supplies. And I don't expect a direct U.S. involvement in war with Iran unless there's American lives at stake within the Gulf region.
Mr. Rushdi, to you about when it comes to the statement given by the Saudi coalition who is fighting a war against the Yemeni Houthi rebels. They said that the weapons were Iranian and they didn't come from Yemen. So what do they actually mean? Where actually they are pointing fingers?
We need international investigation. We cannot depend on the Saudi investigation only, which is something I think normal. That every UN makes its own investigation, even if the NATO or any international institute that makes their own investigation, and then it will be published. It will be declared for the people. Then we can say it's from where the attacks came. This is first. And secondly, which is I think it's very important issue, is that the Saudis knows very well is that what happens is very aggressive attack. That means, just maybe, I'm just making some sort of analysis, is that the Iranian alerts from some sort of action, an aggressive action, it should happen on them, either by the Israelis or maybe by the Americans. That's why the attack happened. So on that way, that means that's why President Rouhani said it shows that there was something planned against Iran so aggressive that it happened on the Aramco issue. But on the other hand, we should also see the consequences. The oil prices, I think it will be increased. The gas prices will be increased. That means the Americans will get benefit from that in a way or another, which means that war has its own benefit, or let's say a tax on.
Okay, Mr. Ahmed Rushdi, your point is well taken. Thank you very much for being on the show. Senior foreign policy advisor to the Speaker of the Iraqi Parliament was joining us from Baghdad. Mr. Mostafa, I'll come back to you. After these attacks on Saudi oil facilities, the global oil prices jumped nearly 15% on Monday, with Brent crude logging its biggest jump in more than 30 years. How do you see who could be the beneficiary out of this whole saga?
Well, for the time being, you could see that the U.S. is getting ready in order to replace Saudi supplies that have been lost. Over 5,700,000 barrels of oil is now missing the market, is lost in the market, and much of it is said to be light crude. We do know that the United States is a net importer of heavy crude, but it's also a net exporter of light crude, and it's probably ready to replace the Saudis in the market for the short run, of course, after they released, Donald Trump issued a decree for releasing a part of the strategic reserve. The same thing has been done by the Saudis, but we have received some reliable information that was just released by one of the Iranian MPs that Saudis have filed a request to import petrol from Iran. And that's a very outstanding piece of news, showing that now market is experiencing turmoil, and for the time being that they are releasing parts of their strategic reserve. This is not felt much. I mean, this increases by 19% from 15 to 19% in different markets of increased prices is nothing compared with what might happen in 2 months from now, because for 1 month or so, they might be able to replace the lost supplies of 5.7 million barrels. But,
Mr. Mostafa, point well taken. How do you think Russian President Vladimir Putin has also quickly pleased that proposed a Russian missile defense system for Saudi Arabia? So, Mr. Mostafa, how do you see this offer? Would it have any sort of influence on the Russian-Iranian relationship?
No, of course. The Russians are trying to run business as an arms exporter. They've been trying to sell arms to everyone from India, Turkey, Iran, and anyone else. That's the same thing that the U.S. does. But probably the best response was the one that was given by senior Yemeni officials, army officials, and Ansarullah officials, who thanked Mr. Putin for his stances in support of the Yemeni people, but at the same time complained that if he is to sell such advanced pieces of equipment to the Saudis, he needs to keep the balance and raise the same offer for the Yemenis as well. I don't know if Putin is presented with such a request from the side of the Yemenis, if he would sell them weapons or not, but that's not a violation of law. As a matter of fact, everyone's talking about this attack on the Saudis.
Okay, so you're of the point of view that this proposal by the Russian president to Saudi Arabia to purchase its missile defense system, which it has already sold to Turkey as well, so there wouldn't be any impact on the relation between Iran and Russia. I'll take this very point to Mr. Ali Demiradas. Sir, how do you think, already we have seen that Turkey has purchased, which infuriated the US because Turkey was a NATO ally. On the other hand, we see that now the Russian president has proposed this for the Saudis. What would be the reaction, do you think, would be from the US?
I don't think a Russian missile sale to Saudi Arabia is going to happen because of Russia's strategic relationship with Iran. Going back to your question, who won in all this, I believe Russia is the biggest winner here. The European customers are now going to be solely focusing on Russia as a source of oil if the instability in the Middle East continues to go on like this. Going back to the oil prices,
do you think it's going to be beneficial for the Russian military industry as well?
Absolutely, yes. Russia has been, the Russian military industry has been having a hard time because of low oil prices. Russia wants to develop Su-57 airplanes, for example, jet fighters, but because of the financial turmoil in Russia, because of the low oil prices, Russia has been unable to develop the Su-57s. If the oil prices go up, if the attacks to Saudi Arabia continues, or if the United States or Saudi Arabia retaliates to Iran, then we should expect that oil prices will skyrocket, go above $100, which is what Mr. Putin would definitely want.
Okay, you're of the view that in this whole situation, it is Russia which is getting the most benefit out of this all. Thank you very much for being on the show, Mr. Ali Demiradas, the foreign policy analyst, joining us from Charleston, South Carolina in the US. And thank you all very much for being on the show today. That's all for now, and we'll see you tomorrow with an in-depth analysis of the latest happenings from around the globe. Till then, it's goodbye.